Imagine living in a world where taking a bath is so rare, people might do it only once a year, where nobles, monks, and peasants alike are crawling with lice, and where drinking water could be more dangerous than drinking wine. Sounds unthinkable, right? But that was daily reality in the Middle Ages. In this video, we're going to peel back the layers of medieval life to uncover the shocking truth about hygiene. Truth that will make you question how anyone survived back then. And trust me, some of these details are not for the faint of heart. From bizarre toothbrushes made out of twigs, to public baths that were anything but private, to soaps that could burn your skin raw. What you're about to hear will completely shatter the picture you thought you had of the Middle Ages. But let's begin with one of the most unsettling realities of all: parasites. Picture this. You're lying in bed after a long day of work in the fields or prayers in the monastery. Suddenly, you feel something crawling under your clothes, biting at your skin. You scratch, but it doesn't stop. Welcome to medieval Europe, where lice and fleas were everywhere, woven into daily life like the very fabric of your tunic. These tiny tormentors didn't care if you were a poor peasant, a wealthy knight, or even a holy monk. They spared no one. Historical records even tell us that Saint Francis of Assisi, one of the most revered religious figures, referred to fleas and lice as the pearls of poverty. Think about that. The suffering was so common that people turned it into a symbol of humility. But how did they fight back? Women would spend hours trying to pick out these pests with little brushes, sometimes near a window or a fire where the light was better. If they were lucky, they could at least kill what they found before the insects spread further. Now you might be asking, if everyone was infested, how did people manage to stay sane? Well, the truth is, many didn't. These pests weren't just annoying. They spread disease, misery, and despair. And yet, parasites were only the beginning. Because if you thought the air was dangerous, wait until you see what people were drinking. Imagine you're parched after a hot summer's day. You walk to the nearest stream, cup your hands, and drink deeply, only to realize that the very water you swallowed was laced with human waste, rotting food and filth thrown in from the streets above. This was the nightmare of medieval water. In most castles and cities, the rivers and wells that supplied people with water were contaminated. With no proper sewage systems, waste was dumped out of windows or tossed directly into rivers. The same streams where women washed clothes and animals were watered also became the source of drinking water. Some cities, like Siena in Italy, tried to regulate water sources and protect clean springs, but it was almost impossible. As populations grew, groundwater was polluted and wells turned foul. So, what did people do? They avoided water. Yes, water, the most basic human necessity, was seen as dangerous. Instead, beer and wine became the daily drink, even for children. Alcohol was safer, or at least less deadly, than the clear liquid flowing through the streets. And here's something even stranger. Drinking water became associated with poverty. If you were seen drinking plain water, you weren't just thirsty. You were poor, desperate, and perhaps reckless. But if water was unsafe and alcohol a daily staple, how did people handle another crucial part of hygiene? Keeping their mouths clean. Now imagine sitting across from someone in a dark tavern, and instead of a smile, you're met with a mouthful of food scraps wedged between their teeth. Not exactly charming, right? But surprisingly, medieval people did care about their teeth. Just not the way we do today. They had no toothpaste, no plastic toothbrushes, no floss. So what did they use? Whatever was close at hand. One popular method was chewing on twigs, especially hazel branches. Sometimes, they'd wrap a bit of cloth around the end to scrub away food stuck between their teeth. Others chewed marshmallow plants, mint leaves, fennel seeds, or even anise. Not just for cleaning, these added a bit of flavor and freshness to their breath. For rinses, people used wine mixed with vinegar. Imagine that burn on your gums. Yet, compared to the taste of rotting food between your teeth, it must have felt refreshing. And here's the fascinating part. Medieval medical texts actually mention oral hygiene. They knew that a foul mouth could make the whole body feel sick, but their methods, of course, were far from perfect. Still, at least they tried to keep their mouths fresh. But what about the rest of the body? How did people actually bathe when even a simple bath was a luxury? Close your eyes and picture this. A steaming wooden tub in the middle of a medieval chamber, servants hauling bucket after bucket of hot water from the kitchen fires. By the time the tub is full, the water is already cooling, and before you even get to enjoy it, others are lining up to share it with you. That was a medieval private bath. In truth, bathing was rarely a solitary act. Even nobles, those who could afford the luxury, relied on multiple attendants to prepare their baths, pour in herbs or oils, and often stay nearby while they bathed. Privacy, practically non-existent. Public baths were even more revealing. Rivers and communal bathhouses became places where men, women, and sometimes entire families bathed together. At first, this was seen as wholesome and practical. After all, hot water was expensive to heat. So why not share? But over time, public baths gained a different reputation. They became associated with scandal, intimacy, and even immorality. In some cities, moral authorities tried to shut them down, fearing the temptations that came when naked bodies gathered under the same roof. Still, for most medieval people, the bath was a rare event. You might go weeks, sometimes months, without one. And if you were poor, forget the luxury of warm water altogether. Yet there was one ritual many people, rich and poor alike, still clung to, especially women, washing the hair, and it was far from simple. If full-body baths were rare, hair washing became the next best thing. And for many medieval women, it was almost sacred. Imagine a Saturday afternoon. Women gather with pitchers of water, basins, and herbal oils. One pours water carefully over another's head while she scrubs away the dust and grime of the week. It wasn't just cleaning. It was a ritual, a pause in the hard rhythm of medieval life. Their shampoos weren't bottles lined up on a shelf. Instead, they made mixtures from herbs, oils, and minerals. If they were lucky, they might have rosemary, chamomile, or even crushed herbs blended with animal fat to create a crude but effective cleanser. Of course, peasants and laborers had less access. They washed their hair far less often, and usually with nothing more than plain water. Still, whether noble or peasant, hair washing almost always required help. You couldn't exactly dump a heavy jug of water over your own head without soaking everything around you. And yet, even these hair rituals were only part of the bigger picture. Because the medieval world had one more weapon in its hygiene arsenal. Something we still use every day, soap. But medieval soap wasn't always what you'd expect. In fact, it could hurt you more than it helped. Today, we think of soap as gentle, fragrant, and refreshing. But in the Middle Ages, soap could be closer to a chemical weapon. Medieval soap wasn't made in shiny factories. It was mixed in cauldrons, often from ashes, lime, animal fat, or olive oil, depending on where you lived. In Northern Europe, animal fat was common. In the Mediterranean, oil was used. Sometimes, lemon juice and salt were thrown in to boost its strength. The result? A harsh, caustic substance that could strip grease from pots and skin. Poorer people used these rough, lye-heavy soaps that burned, cracked, and aged the flesh as much as they cleaned it. For them, hygiene was painful. The wealthy, however, enjoyed something else entirely. They could afford soaps perfumed with lavender, rose, or herbs, carefully molded into bowls or bars. To a noblewoman, the scent of soap wasn't just about cleanliness. It was a status symbol. So once again, even soap itself became a marker of class. The poor suffered with raw, stinging skin, while the rich smelled sweet and floral. But here's the twist. Despite all this effort with soap, herbs, and rituals, the Middle Ages still weren't nearly as filthy as you might imagine. In fact, one medieval medical school gave advice that might sound surprisingly modern. If you think medieval people ignored hygiene altogether, you'd be mistaken. In fact, one of the most respected medical schools of the Middle Ages, the School of Salerno in Italy, produced a guide to healthy living between the 12th and 13th centuries. This guide, known as the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, pulled wisdom from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, as well as from Arab scholars. And some of its advice, shockingly familiar. The text recommended starting each morning by washing your hands and face with cold water to wake up the body. Stretch your limbs, comb your hair, clean your teeth, even move around a little to get your blood flowing. Sound familiar? It's almost the medieval version of a modern morning routine. They believed these small rituals didn't just refresh the body, they relaxed the brain and improved overall health. For a world where baths were rare and water was risky, this daily attention to hygiene was surprisingly progressive. So, while the Middle Ages certainly had their horrors, lice, foul water, harsh soaps, they weren't as careless about cleanliness as the stereotypes suggest. But here's the real question. How did people endure such conditions when daily life seemed like a battle against dirt, disease, and discomfort? So, what do we make of medieval hygiene? On one hand, it was brutal. Lice crawling under your clothes, water that could poison you, soaps that burned your skin. On the other, it was surprisingly thoughtful. Herbal hair rinses, improvised toothbrushes, and even medical guides that preached morning routines not so different from our own. The Middle Ages weren't a time of total filth. They were a world constantly improvising, fighting to stay clean with the limited knowledge and tools they had. Now let me ask you, could you have survived in that world? Would you have braved the public baths, chewed on mint leaves for fresh breath, or drunk beer every day instead of water? Drop your answer in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And if this glimpse into the hidden side of history fascinated you, make sure to subscribe for more stories that reveal just how strange and human the past really was. Because remember, the dirt of history often hides its most unforgettable truths.